be seated, grab a coffee. Hi, good morning and warm welcome everybody to this Baltic Breakfast. Today we're going to talk about acidification and its linkage to climate change. Great to see so many people here, and also welcome to all of you who are online following us this really wintry morning here in Stockholm. My name is Gun Rudqvist and I work as Head of Policy at the Stockholm University Baltic Sea Center. And we are the center organizing these Baltic Breakfasts. And we do that, once a month in order to increase the connections and the dialogues between research and the rest of society. As always, we have two excellent speakers with us today. I'll introduce them really shortly. And you can also pose questions, either you here in the room after the presentations. We'll have about 15 minutes to talk to each other. But you can also send us an email, and it's at ostersjocentrum.su.se, or use Slido, and the code is, as always, 22102, 22102. And I'll try to remember to remind you about the code later on. If there are tons of questions that we don't get to sort of answer today, we'll try to write answers and put them on our web, so keep an eye on the web later on. And today's topic then, acidification. With rising carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, it also means rising levels of carbon dioxide in the sea, causing acidification, the evil twin of climate change. So today we're going to hear more about this. How does it work? Is it the same in the open ocean? What about the coastal areas? And what about effects? What are the impacts? And then finally, is there something we can do? And what would be the actions that would be necessary and most suitable at the moment? So with us today, we have Erik Gustafsson, who's an oceanographer and researcher at the Stockholm University Baltic Sea Center. And then we have Sam Dupont, who's a senior lecturer at the Department of Biology and Environmental Sciences at the University of Gothenburg. Warm welcome to both of you, and Erik, the floor is yours.
So let's see, can you now hear me? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so as Gun mentioned here, ocean acidification has sometimes been called the evil twin of global warming. It's sometimes called the other CO2 problem. And the reason is this strong link between our emissions and the pH development of the oceans. So I will now talk about past emissions and pH response, and also potential future changes. And I will start from a global perspective and then move on into the Baltic Sea. So here you can first see the estimated fossil fuel emissions on a global level from 1850 until today. And there is, as you can see, a very strong increase from the 1950s or so. And over the past 10 years or so, you can see that the emissions have been persistently high, but there is possibly a tendency that the emissions starts to level out a little bit. So the increase is not so fast anymore, it seems, which is a good sign. But still, emissions are increasing. And where does this CO2 end up? This is illustrated by the pie chart here. So you can see the biggest piece of the pie, this is the atmospheric increase. So about 45% of our emissions accumulate in the atmosphere. And this is what causes the CO2 increase in the air, of course. Then about 30% is taken up on land, and 25% is absorbed by the oceans. And then this CO2 absorbed by the oceans, this leads to a series of chemical reactions. And one effect is the decreasing pH over time. So this is the ocean acidification. I included here a clear example of ongoing acidification. You can see here you can see pH data from the late 1980s until today. This is from a station in the Pacific Ocean. So you see this very clear decreasing pH trend. and presently this rate is about 0.02 units per decade. Now if we move on into the possible future. So you can see here again the past emissions from 1850, and then the lines of different colors here indicate different possible emission scenarios. So the blue line, this shows what would be required to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, this would require a massive reduction in CO2 emissions in the near future. We don't know what the future will be, but we know that we are currently not on track for this scenario. So based on current policies, a more likely development is that we manage a more moderate mitigation of emissions. So there are a couple of examples here where the emissions could peak around year 2040 and then start to decrease. And then we would get a more pronounced global warming as a result. It's also possible that emissions continue to increase throughout this century. This has been deemed as less likely because this would mean a reversal of some current policies, but it's still possible. And you can also see the more dystopian worst case scenario here, which is hopefully quite unlikely. So what is the pH response to these emissions? This is illustrated here, where you can see the typical global surface ocean pH and the response to our CO2 emissions. So over the past century, you can see a pH decrease of about 0.1 units. And then you can see the potential future developments depending on emissions. So if we could manage to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement with the massive CO2 reductions, you can see that the pH trend, the acidification trend, would start to level out in the coming decades, and pH would again start to increase during this century. A more likely development is that we manage, again, a more moderate mitigation of emissions. And in that case, we could expect a continuous decrease of pH of 0.1 units or more during this century. And in the more pessimistic emission scenarios, this pH decrease would be quite dramatic, as you can see. So, yeah, there is, you can see, an additional very strong incentive then to curb our CO2 emissions, because in addition to the climate change, it also affects the acidification of the ocean. And this pH development is quite predictable in the open oceans. There are other processes that can cause pH trends over time, but these are typically quite slow compared to the CO2 effect. This might not be the case in coastal seas, such as the Baltic Sea. So in coastal seas, we have these strong interactions between land and sea, and there are other processes that can then counteract or enhance ocean acidification. This is illustrated by the figure here. So there are processes such as properties of the freshwater input, changes in runoff and salinity, changes in production and respiration patterns over time, and on top of this, the ocean acidification effect. So what has been observed, for example, from the Baltic Sea, is that there are some areas, for example, the central Baltic and the Gulf of Bothnia, where the ocean acidification has to some degree been counteracted over the last couple of decades. There are also other areas where the pH decrease has been faster than in the open oceans. So you can say in general that ocean acidification and pH development is much more complex and variable in coastal seas compared to the open ocean. In the case of the Baltic Sea, there are also quite large differences between different subbasins. On one hand, in terms of salinity, but also in terms of pH characteristics. So in the figure to the left here, you can see the typical annual development of pH from a few different areas in the Baltic Sea. So there are, on one hand, quite large differences in the typical pH level. This is coupled to different salinity and alkalinity and properties of the river water entering different subbasins. There are also quite large differences in the seasonal variations. So pH typically increases in spring and summer. This is because of the CO2 uptake by phytoplankton during the plankton blooms. And then when organic material is again decomposed, CO2 is again released to the water and pH decreases in autumn and winter. So you can see the different timing of the pH increase. This is related to the different timing of plankton blooms in different areas. And you can say in general that the more eutrophic and productive an area is, the larger the seasonal pH variations. So what about the future development of the Baltic Sea? This is something that we can address by means of model calculations. I included one example here where you see the potential future development of pH in the Gotland Sea. So there are on one hand quite large seasonal variations. Again, this is because of production and respiration patterns. And there is, on top of this, a long-term decreasing pH trend, which is the ocean acidification. So I think you can see here how the annual minimum level of pH is gradually decreasing because of the ocean acidification. And you can imagine that there are different pH thresholds where pH levels can become harmful for the organisms. And the effect of ocean acidification is that the exposure to harmful pH levels can gradually increase over time. This particular model experiment was a case with high nutrient loads of the Baltic Sea and quite eutrophic conditions, which results in quite large seasonal variations of pH. This can be compared to an example where the Baltic Sea has recovered from eutrophication because of lower nutrient loads. So recovery from eutrophication on one hand means improved oxygen conditions, improved water transparency and so on. But it also has a quite large impact on pH. You can see this in the lower panel. So the seasonal variations are much smaller, in this case with a low productive Baltic Sea. So one effect, or the combined effect of eutrophication and acidification, is then that the seasonal pH extremes tends to be more pronounced, which can then be harmful for the organisms. Yeah. So what we can also see from our model simulations is that there is no process in the Baltic Sea that can counteract acidification in the long run, unless we manage this massive reduction of CO2 emissions. If we manage a more moderate mitigation of the emissions, we can expect a continuous pH decrease of about 0.1 units over the century. And in the more pessimistic scenarios, this pH decrease would be quite strongly pronounced, as you can see. There is, in contrast to eutrophication, not so easy to control acidification. Eutrophication can be controlled by local and regional measures. Acidification really depends on emissions on a global level. So it's a bit difficult to set future goals in terms of Baltic Sea acidification management. It's, however, still very important to monitor the development of acidification. And considering the large differences between different areas in the Baltic Sea, it's important that the monitoring covers the entire Baltic. We can expect quite different consequences of acidification in different parts of the Baltic. It's important to increase the knowledge of possible consequences on ecosystem and organisms. You will hear more about this in the next presentation. And finally, it's becoming increasingly important to minimize effects of other pressures in the Baltic Sea. So I mentioned already the eutrophication. You can also think about overfishing, hazardous substances, and so on. So potentially, the Baltic Sea can become more resilient to climate and acidification effects if we can minimize these other pressures. So what is often mentioned is this so-called multi-stressor or multi-pressure approach, where the acidification is one additional stressor on top of these other problems we have in the Baltic Sea. Yeah, and before we move on, I will just show you this new policy brief that we have. You can find it here, or you can find it online.
Thank you, Erik. Warm hand. Thanks a lot for guiding us through this sort of really complex issue. But what you're saying is that acidification is so linked to the other stressors. But what is the most important stressor then, if you look at the quality of, for instance, the Baltic Sea?
In the case of the Baltic Sea, I would say eutrophication.
So even though it's sort of counteracting acidification, you would still say act on eutrophication, or?
Yeah, because as I mentioned, the eutrophication tends to enhance the pH extremes, and this can then be harmful for the organisms.
Okay, so we're getting back to the pH extreme in the next presentation to declare that a bit more. All right. And you also stressed that it's different in coastal areas in relation to the open sea.
Yeah.
Why is that then?
Yeah, so the reason is that in the coastal seas there are other processes, this land-sea interactions. So other processes can cause pH trends over time, in addition to the ocean acidification. And these processes can either enhance or counteract the ocean acidification effect. So
trickier to deal with and needs more research, I suppose.
Yeah, and you can say that coastal seas are definitely more complex in terms of pH development over time. Yeah.
Thank you so far. You'll be back with us talking again. Thanks, Erik. Yeah. And we will move on directly. Sam Dupont, welcome here.
Thank you.
You haven't traveled that far yesterday, only from Gothenburg, so that's nice.
Far and wide.
Yeah, right. So we will hear more about effects then and talk more about biodiversity and other aspects. Please, Sam.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's really nice to be here. And so basically what I'm going to try to do today is move from the chemical change to the biological change, and also the impact it can have on us as a society, and more importantly about what can we do about it. So there's been 10,000 publications on ocean acidification now, so we know a lot. We know basically, we are virtually certain that it's happening. There is no question there. The IPCC used that kind of phrasing. This is extremely clear. But the next question, of course, is like, what will be the consequences? And to study that is not as easy in a way. I think chemistry is complicated. Biology is sometimes even worse. We have places like Christineberg or the Marine Station along the Baltic Sea here that can help us through different types of experiment to try to evaluate what can happen under different scenarios. So we can do experiment in the lab, observation in the field, and we can also go back in the past and try to answer this question: what can be the biological consequences of ocean acidification? One way of looking at that is go back in the past of the planet. Did that happen before? And the answer is yes. At the end of the Permian, you had a change in volcanic activity, and a lot of carbon dioxide has been released into the atmosphere. And basically what happened was climate change, acidification, all the things we are seeing today. And what happened back then? The third extinction, the biggest extinction on the planet. So 92% of all marine species went extinct. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen now, but that's a good reason to worry. When it happened before, it had huge consequences. So the conditions are different today, so we can expect different outcome, but still, we should worry about those. Another line of evidence is basically go in the lab and simulate different future, and that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years. The first paper we did, and that's just one example, is like we decided, okay, let's go and collect an important species around the area, and that's that stuff on the left called a brittle star. Really important, really high density in the Atlantic Ocean. We collected them, brought them to the lab, created larvae, so we collected eggs and sperm, put them in culture, and then simulate what can happen in 20 years, in 50 years. So we basically decreased the pH and checked what happened. This is how they look like when they are today. So it's called a Pluteus larvae, beautiful little thing swimming in the water for about a month. This is how they look like when we decrease the pH by 0.2 pH units. So it's not an extreme crazy scenario. That's something that at the time, 15 years ago, we said that may happen within a few decades. So monsters, they can't develop, they all die within 5 days. Unfortunately, when we published that, we said, okay, we need to cut carbon dioxide emission, or these guys may go locally extinct. Of course, it didn't change anything so far. We're still increasing CO2. They are gone now. So I've been back with my student to the same sites. They are locally extinct. So unfortunately, we were right. And there are also evidence that acidification has impact already today on things we care about. So this is an example of something that happened in 2007. On the west coast of the US, the oyster farmer couldn't produce oyster that year. And they didn't really understand where it was coming from. And then scientists from Washington joined in, and they realized it was because of acidification. So in a nutshell, acidification has an impact already today and will have an increasing impact in the future on a range of different species. So if you ever heard about acidification, most of the time what you hear is that marine calcifiers, or organisms that build shells made of calcium carbonate, are negatively impacted. And that's true. But it was not necessarily true for all the calcifiers. And I'm sorry, I'm going to come with a bit of chemistry to explain you why, but that's basically a misunderstanding, because the field of acidification was driven by chemists at the beginning, and they thought that's going to have an impact on marine building these shells out of calcium carbonate because of this equation. So that's in a nutshell what acidification is doing. You put more CO2, that makes more carbonic acid, that's increasing what is called bicarbonate, and then you have less carbonate ion. So the chemists say, okay, if there's less carbonate ion in the water, that's going to be terrible if you want to build calcium carbonate, because less breaks for calcification, meaning less shells. But that's not how biocalcification works. And that's showing us the importance of different fields to talk to each other, because actually biocalcification works like this. It's calcium with two bicarbonates, and bicarbonate is actually increasing under acidification scenario. So the reason why organisms are negatively impacted, it's not because of a problem of calcification. The real reason is because of pH regulation. All living organisms have to keep the pH right inside their cells, their blood, including yourself. If the pH goes wrong into your blood, you're going to get cancer. I think that's a side effect of the enzymes not working properly. So what the marine organism is experiencing under acidification is that you have more proton on the water. This goes inside your blood, inside your cells. So that's actually really bad. The enzymatic activities goes wrong, so you start to have problems. So what the organism needs to do is to get rid of them, get rid of the out of the cell, and every organism has to do that to get the pH right inside their cells. But that costs a lot of energy. And if you use energy for something like that, you have less energy for growth, for everything else, for reproduction, and that have negative effects. So potentially every organism can be negatively impacted by acidification. And today we have evidence that about 50% of all the marine species that have been tested showed negative response to acidification. So that's not just a few examples. This is a massive thing. And of course, that can cascade to the whole ecosystem. And in particular, in the Baltic Sea, where the ecosystem is relatively simple, if you lose a few, that will have cascading effect on the whole ecosystem. So again, we have really good reason to worry. It's happening for sure on things we care about, including some of the seafood we eat. And so it's really important that we do something as fast as possible. And that's the very depressing first part of my talk. Okay, things are going in the wrong direction. But the next part is like, okay, what can we do about this? Is there something that we can do today? The situation is this. That's us, and that's climate change, acidification, and all the horrible things we do on the ocean. So in a situation like that, there are three things you can do. You can wait and see, which is basically what we do today, right? Bad idea, obviously. Second thing is you run and you hide. Seems very smart, because by doing that you can buy some time. The cat will still be around though. So the real solution is kill the cat. Right? So if you're a little mouse like this, it's difficult. So what you have to do is hide, join forces with all the mouse, come back and kill the cat. That's what we have to do. It's a global problem. We can't fix it in Sweden. We have to work together with everybody and go back. But in the meantime, we need to buy the time. And that's the important part. And when it comes to acidification and climate change, it's what is called mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, reduce carbon dioxide emission, it's kill the cat. It's not easy, it's going to take time. Adaptation is buy time. And that's what we can do locally. So mitigation, kill the cat. We don't need more science. The science is there. We have the IPCC report, 10,000 pages of summary of science, COP meetings. Like basically, we have the SDGs. It's in the air. People know what they have to do. No, we just have to have maybe a better way of communicating or a smarter way to communicate to actually make that happen. But the important part is that it's adaptation. There are things we can do right now, and Erik already mentioned some of that. There are 3 lines of adaptation that we can put into action right away. We need to protect at all costs what we have. Marine ecosystems have been damaged for a long time. We need to protect especially blue carbon habitat. We need to protect what we have because the more biodiverse an ecosystem, the more resilient it is. And if it is resilient, it's going to last longer when it comes to these global changes like climate change and acidification. So we can protect important areas. We can manage multiple stressors, as Erik said. Let's work on eutrophication. That's going to save us some time. We're going to buy some time by doing this. Then, unfortunately, a lot of ecosystems have been already quite damaged today. So let's restore those. We can already do that today. We have options to restore some of the key ecosystems. And then you can do things better. Aquaculture can be really damaging. Fishery can be damaging. Let's try to find alternative ways of doing this. But today, if you read the IPCC reports or the policy reports, you're going to see that there's a lot of emphasis on other solutions, which are basically trying to get negative emission. So that's basically nature-based solution and all these new phrasing that are all around the place. And in particular, you have 3 lines of action. You have something called ocean alkalinization. I will explain what it is in a second. Seagrass restoration or other blue carbon restoration and aquaculture. Like have different ways of doing aquaculture that to be less damaging. These are really good ideas on paper, but sometimes we just don't know enough. And that's where we need more research. We need to be sure that if we implement some of these actions, that will have really the positive effect that is expected. So I'm going to just explain what ocean alkalinity announcement is. So if you look on the long time scale, like centuries, acidification will solve it, but will be solved by itself because of something called weathering. So basically the rocks get dissolved, that's changing the chemistry of the ocean, and basically the pH will go back to normal. The thing is that it's going to take a long time. So what is proposed here is to basically speed up the process. Take the rocks, grind them, throw the things in the water. Basically what has been done in lake during the acid rain period is liming the ocean. So that's seriously considered, and companies love it, because if they do that, they can buy carbon credit and keep emitting as much as they do. The problem is that nobody knows if it works, right? It works on paper, but as it works in practice, nobody knows, because it's really hard to really evaluate how much carbon is captured. And 2, is there side effects? So recently, if you're interested, we published a best practice guide, and we put like a lot of cautious there. We don't know if it works. I've made some recent experiment on that, and there are side effects. If you change the alkalinity of the water really high, organisms don't like it. So a good idea on paper, but I don't think that's a magical solution. Another thing is, let's restore, for example, blue carbon ecosystem or seagrass, or like, for example, farming of algae. Again, good idea. These things are photosynthetic. They capture carbon, a little bit like what Erik said about the plankton bloom. And eutrophication, it's capturing carbon through photosynthesis. The thing is that we just have a recent study showing that there are also side effects of that under acidification scenario. Because what's happening is that, sure, during the day, the pH goes up because of photosynthesis. During the night, the pH goes down because of respiration. And so basically what's happening is, sure, the pH on average is higher, but the variability increases quite a bit. And what we showed is that organisms, they don't care about average. They don't care about the maximum pH. They care about the minimum pH. And under this scenario, the pH is lower than before, right? So sure, it's capturing carbon, but the pH goes lower than before, and that has negative effect on the organism. So in conclusion of all that, we are sure, I think there is no doubt that there will be impact, and there's already visible impact of acidification. 2, we need both mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, killing the cat, is what we need to do, but we need time, so we need adaptation. And then we need definitely to communicate better what we know, to be sure that these things are taken into account. And just be careful when people come with solutions that will fix everything. It's not the case. Some of these solutions should be explored, should be tested, but I don't think today that we have any magical solutions. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks. That's really interesting. It's a nice way of putting things in perspectives. We talked before with Erik about the extremes, and you touched upon them lately. So what you're saying is that let's not settle for average. Let's look at the extremes. Why are they more interested in the extremes?
It's like us. Like when you have global warming in a place, right? I think the temperatures slowly increase. But when people die is when you have heat waves. That's at the moment where, because basically that's when you reach your physiological limit. And it's the same with organisms. And the thing what we see is that not only the variability increase, but this extreme events like global, like heat waves, but acid wave are also happening more and more. So the organisms, they don't care about average because you can't feel an average. You can't feel the average temperature of the week. What you're going to feel is the extreme low, the extreme high, and that's what is actually stressing you.
So would you say that that concept is being in the debate, or are people still looking at the sort of average?
The thing is that when the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal, have been released, the target is the average pH.
Okay,
And the community responded immediately, and together with the IOC UNESCO, we made like a document saying, okay, the average is not good. We need to measure the extreme. So we need more monitoring, but we don't need to monitor the average. What we need is monitor the extremes, because that's what, biologically speaking, that's what matters. And I think it's getting into the head of everybody now. There is more and more evidence that we need to understand the variability, we need to understand the extremes.
Okay. You were also touching upon seagrasses. I mean, there are
Yes.
many other reasons for taking care of them, but
Yeah.
again, would it be simplified to sort of put all your coins or your
Yeah,
eggs in that basket?
I can see that it could misinterpret. We need to restore seagrasses,
Yeah.
right? No doubt about that. So that's a very important ecosystem. There are so many services. What just sometimes people try to sell it for the wrong reason, and I think that's not going to solve acidification for sure. I think that's an important thing to do, but not for that reason.
Okay.
So that's okay. I think there's enough reason to restore seagrass that we need to
other
use that
reasons, yeah,
argument. Yes.
Thanks. Please stay here. Erik, join us and let's continue talking to each other. And I will remind everybody about the Slido code 22102 for those online who want to pose questions. And I have a colleague who is now running around with a microphone, Ellen, here. So please, anybody want to pose a question, or shall I? All right, I give you a moment to think then. We also talked about, I mean, please, Erik, come and join us a bit closer here. You both touched upon the coastal areas and the difficulties in relation to the open seas. Would you say that there is enough research then focusing on the coastal areas? Maybe this is a given answer, I know.
I can at least say from the point of monitoring that there is not enough monitoring.
Okay.
So we need to cover more areas of the Baltic Sea, and we need to improve the coverage in time as well. So as Sam mentioned, we need to capture these extremes and not just the average development.
And I would say from the biological point of view, most of the research is done on the coast for obvious reasons. That's where the biology is. But the problem is that most of the time biology depends on chemical data to design experiments that are right. If we want to test scenario, we need to know what the scenarios are. And we don't have the chemistry and we don't have the models to actually do that. So most of the time we work, but it's harder. So we need definitely more interactions with the monitoring and modeling community to do that right. But most of the work is done on the coastal zone.
Okay, so that's a good example of collaboration and talking to each other. Yes, please.
Yeah, we got already some questions from the online audience. Okay. So here's one that I'm translating to English. So the person is asking, pH at the surface is one thing, but what do you know about the pH changes deeper down, like 5-10 meter bottoms or 20-30 meter bottoms? Okay. How far down can you see these chemical changes?
Okay. Erik.
Yeah, so for the open oceans, you can see it's thousands of meters in the deep. It takes longer time because the immediate effect is this equilibration between CO2 in the air and the surface water, but then the ocean is ventilating and mixing. So eventually we see these effects also in the deeper parts. Yeah, so we can see it everywhere, for sure. Also in the Baltic Sea.
And maybe I can mention something along those lines too, is that what I care about as a biologist is what the organism I study is experiencing. And sometimes they live in habitat where we have no information at all. Like if they live inside the sediment, for example, the conditions down there are very different from what is in the open water because they breathe and then the pH is influenced by that too. And also most organisms, they don't stay where they are. So if I want to understand what they experience, I need to know where they travel and the pH everywhere, which is very complicated. So most of the time we don't have this kind of information, but we can take like informed guess, I would say, like trying to understand. But that's the complicated part. It's like the sensors, they are in one place. And my organism, most of the time they don't live there and they also travel around.
Yeah, they don't have the sense to stay there where you check it up. All right, any more questions, comments? Down there, Ellen, further down, way down below there. Oh, okay, we start there then. Please, Henrik.
I have a question. The fish fauna is producing alkalinity, especially in the deep ocean, the mesopelagic fish fauna increases alkalinity. What would you comment on that? Is it an important buffering of the ocean ecosystem?
So fishes produce alkalinity. Is it buffering enough, or what happens?
I mean, the thing is that if it's only increasing alkalinity, and it depends on the levels. As I said, we are testing at the moment a range of alkalinity because we knew a lot about lowering alkalinity, but not so much about increasing alkalinity. What we see now is that there's also a threshold for alkalinity that organisms don't like. So it's a question of how much you increase it. It can buffer a little bit for sure, but how much you buffer is that. But I think it's not only increasing alkalinity, that's also the effect. Like, for example, in fish farm, the CO2 emissions are ridiculous because of the density of the fish. Sometimes you have 10,000 ppm in the aquaculture setting. So I think it's probably also what else is added. But definitely, if you increase a little bit the alkalinity, that can have a little bit of a buffering effect. Sure.
Please present yourselves also, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Francisco Nascimento from Stockholm University. So Sam, you mentioned that around 50% of the organisms that have been studied have shown strong effects due to acidification. So do we know anything about the physiological mechanisms that help to explain why only half of the ones studied respond to these changes?
So it's because of local adaptation, I would say. So as in this room, not everybody has the same potential to cope with stress. Like, some of us are better than others. And that's the same for every species in the ocean. We know that physiological mechanism to cope with acidification exists, because if you go to the deep sea and go to this beautiful CO2 vents ecosystem, the pH there can be as low as 5, which is something that will never happen on the surface. And when you check what's down there, you have calcifiers, you have mussels, you have beautiful ecosystem, you have tube worms. So we know that physiologically speaking, it's possible to do it, but it costs a lot of energy. So it's always about trade-offs. If you have a need for something, evolution will work toward it. The problem is that in most places on the coast, the organism never had to cope with that. If you go to the Arctic Ocean, pH is very stable, temperature is very stable, so they kind of lose this ability to cope with these changes. So in that case, they don't have the capacity to do it. So in theory, it's there in nature, but if you don't need it, you lose it. That's how evolution works. So in some places, they never use it, so they lose it, so they're very sensitive. Some other species, they're exposed to more variation, they're exposed to sometimes heat waves or acid wave, and then they can cope with it. So it's basically, evolution is a cheap process. Like, for example, we lost the ability to regenerate. And many of our ancestors, if you chop a limb, it's regrowth. We lost it because we don't need it. And that's also why you have organisms that are sensitive and others not.
Yeah, can I just add a question there? Because you stressed a lot in your talk, the resilience aspects. Would you say that in the general debate on acidification, is that part of the answer, making sure that the ecosystems are resilient?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why restoration, that's why protection of healthy ecosystem is so important, because the healthier, the more biodiverse, the more resilient they will be to any stress. And acidification is not a stress that is that different from some other kind of stress. Yeah. So basically, if you make the ecosystem stress resilient, that's of course, it's not going to solve the problem. Every species, every ecosystem has a threshold, a limit. But you can make it a little bit more resilient by managing it in the right way.
Yeah, you hear that, but on the other hand, you have here single solutions is the one way to go. Right, we'll get back to that. Please.
Hi there, Jean-Baptiste Thomas from KTH. So you've been discussing eutrophication and the effect of increased nutrients in the water on acidification. Can you comment on temperature changes and the likely effects of ocean heat waves?
Erik, temperature.
Yeah, so the temperature effect, on one hand, changing the temperature means you change also the carbon chemistry. So for example, increased temperature, let's say global warming over time, leads to a decreased solubility of CO2. So increasing temperature means a reduced capacity to take up CO2 for the water. Another effect is that global warming will, over time, strengthen the stratification of the oceans, which means the surface layer becomes a little bit less volume, and this also means a less capacity to take up CO2.
So maybe you can explain stratification. It's not a general for us.
Yeah.
layman.
So for example, think about the temperature stratification. If you take a swim in a lake, It's warmer than the surface and colder further down. So this is temperature stratification. There is also salinity stratification, and this stratification acts as a barrier for mixing and exchange of properties in the oceans.
Right. Can I also? Do you want to ask a question?
I
Right.
do, actually.
Please, Ellen.
Hi, I'm Ellen from Baltic Sea Center. You talk or water from land, lakes and rivers are usually less pH, right? So if you get more runoff with climate change, would that influence the coastal areas more?
Okay, runoff from the area of the
Yeah.
land.
So that's the main reason that we see these, or one of the reasons that we see the quite large differences in pH characteristics in the Baltic Sea. So on one hand, it has to do with the properties of ocean water and river water, and it also has to do with the properties of the individual rivers. So the alkalinity and pH will be different in different areas, and this is related to properties of the bedrock in the areas. So in some regions, like the Gulf of Riga, we have this very high pH because of limestone-rich catchment areas. In the Botanic Bay, it's the opposite. So yeah, that's a strong influence.
So that again brings us back to more research that is locally adapted, etc. Being in the coastal areas. Okay, Lisa, one from the net, and then we have one up here. A question.
Yes, could you explain the potential effects on Baltic Sea ecosystem based on the acidification scenarios? Like, what would a decrease on 0.1 or 0.3 mean to the ecosystem, I guess?
The thing is that I don't think we have enough data to give a proper answer to that, so I'm not going to be really specific, but what can be expected for sure is decreased biodiversity. So there will be some species that will be negatively impacted and that will be gone, with cascading effect on the ecosystem. So simplification of the ecosystem very likely. But I don't think we have enough locally relevant biological information to really make projections. To be fair, I don't think we will ever have that kind of knowledge. And that's okay. I think we don't need necessarily. What we need to know at the moment is what are the probabilities that trouble will happen under different scenarios, and what are the main stressors that we need to manage. So definitely eutrophication, overfishing, and how acidification is working in combination with all those things. So we actually can provide guidance to management. I think that's basically what the priority is today. It's not curiosity-driven science anymore. We don't want to make projections that will, give us like a picture of what's going to happen in the future. We know it's going to be bad. Decreased biodiversity can't lead to anything positive. So basically what we need now is priorities in terms of actions. What can be done in the most efficient way. So I'm sorry that I don't have the proper answer for that, but simplification for sure.
Thank you. One more.
Thank you. Johanna Fox from WWF Baltic Program. I had a very similar question, and it was around the priorities. Is it possible to model dependent on various management scenarios? Are we reducing eutrophication? Are we fixing the issue with overfishing? And what those effects would be coupled to scenarios of ocean acidification?
I think we are getting there. It's not there yet, and the reason why it's not there yet is we know a lot about individual stressors. We know quite a lot about eutrophication. We know more and more about acidification, about temperature. So that's really well resolved. And there are some models now that try to make, if we reduce that, that's going to benefit in that way. But what is really lacking is this idea of what happens when you combine them. And when you combine them, you have what is called non-linear effects, so things that are unexpected and complicated. And to do that, we need to have a little bit more research. And the good point is that the scientific community is very aware of that and moving into that direction. There is a collaboration between ecotoxicologists and global change scientists to try to resolve this so we can actually improve the models and have a more realistic view of what can happen. Because at the moment, the models are underestimating the effects. That's the problem, because we don't see this kind of unexpected effect like when you... But it's getting there. We can already provide, science can provide some ideas now with uncertainties, and the uncertainty needs to be decreased. I think that would be the thing. But yeah, absolutely. For me, that's the way to go now.
Time is flying. I'd like to put a final question to you. You both of you touched upon what can we do now? And if we skip the answer of sort of reducing the level of carbon dioxide, we all need to know that. But what else can be done? Who wants to start? What's the advice you would give to policymakers today when you meet somebody?
Yeah, for me it would be to repeat this point, really focus on the other stressors in the ecosystems.
And the other stresses would be eutrophication, overfishing, etc.
Overfishing, hazardous substances, and so on. Yeah.
And if I was a billionaire, I would put my money on protecting what we have. Absolutely, like basically extend the marine protected areas and be sure that we protect the important ecosystems we have. I think it's supposed to be in the SDGs that we're going to reach 30% of marine protected area by 2030. I don't think it's good. Sweden is doing a good job along those lines, but many countries are not. So I think that would be, for me personally, what I would invest my money.
Thank you, and thanks all of you, and give a warm applause to the excellent speakers here. And it's excellent that you're talking about MPAs, marine protected areas, because that's part of the topic for the next Baltic Breakfast. And it's already in a fortnight, actually, February 22nd, and it will be in Swedish, though. We will be talking about protected areas in relation to fish regulations. So all of you, you're warmly welcome back then. And until then, have a nice day and keep in touch.
Thank you.